Welcome to the Institute of Politics. On the night before the inauguration in 2008, I got a phone call from Rahm Emanuel, who is going to be the chief of staff for the incoming president, and he said, "We've been with the Homeland Security people from the Bush administration all day, and there is what we feel is a credible threat on the inauguration, and I need you, because I can't tell anybody else, I need you to write a 60-second statement." I was the new senior advisor to the president, advising people to disperse in case the president-elect has to disperse the crowd at the inauguration. And I want you to meet him in the speaker's office and give him this envelope, and he'll put it in his pocket, and the Secret Service will tap him on the shoulder if it would become necessary. And I remember staying awake this night before I became an employee of the federal government on Inauguration Eve, listening to sirens in the night and wondering what might transpire the next day. And my wife and my son were scheduled to join the President-elect and President Bush at a ceremonial service, church service. I had to go off and do something else. And I really didn't want them to go, and I couldn't tell them why they shouldn't. So they went. And then nothing happened, and I gave the President-elect his statement, and I watched the inaugural ceremony and watched this crowd of 2 million people, and what should have been a moment of exultation was also a moment of great anxiety as I wondered, might something happen? I raise that because I learned in those hours what we were going to confront as a new administration. This is a dangerous world, a challenging world, and we rely on the people who gather intelligence to help protect the American people and protect the interests of Americans. And so John Brennan, who was the White House Homeland Security advisor to the president when I was in the White House, was someone who I came to really rely on and admire and respect. And I'm so pleased that he's here tonight. You know, he has nothing else to do right now. And so in order to fill his free time, we offered, he actually was scheduled to be here last month, and there were reasons that he could not come. And I'm so grateful to him for fulfilling that obligation tonight. And it does come at a propitious time, lots to talk about. So to introduce our speaker and moderator tonight, let me introduce Emily Feigenbaum, who is a second-year student from Dix Hills. She informs me Dix Hills is on Long Island, for those of you who might not know. Emily has been, she was a team leader for Michael Morrell, who actually was the acting director of the CIA and a fellow in the fall, and was a fellows ambassador when Jeff Greenfield was here. She was asked, I guess filled out a form, why are you interested in this event? I have a passion for politics, government, and international security. You're in the right place. And let me just say before I bring her up here, we will be taking questions. Be a microphone placed in the middle aisle during this program. And as always, let me just remind you that in the spirit of open discourse and rigorous inquiry, we invite you to bring your best questions to the discussions. With this admonition, questions end with a question mark, and let's have a good discussion. With that, let me introduce Emily.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome. It is an honor and privilege to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Director of the Central Intelligence Agency, John Brennan. After graduating with a master's degree in government from the University of Texas at Austin, Director Brennan joined the CIA in 1980. Climbing the ranks of the agency, he became a daily briefer for President Clinton, Chief of Staff to former CIA Director George Tenet, Founding Director of the Terrorist Threat Integration Center, Director of the National Counterterrorism Center, Homeland Security Advisor and Chief Counterterrorism Advisor to President Obama. In 2013, he was appointed to the office of Director of the CIA. When President Obama nominated Director Brennan, the president praised him for his long-standing dedication to public service and his commitment to critical inquiry. He has worked to embed our efforts in a strong legal framework, President Obama said. He understands we are a nation of laws. In moments of debate and decision, he asks the tough questions and he insists on high and rigorous standards. After almost 3 decades of government service, Director Brennan is still asking the tough questions, whether they're about the role of the Russian government in the past US presidential election, or the potentially detrimental consequences of the incoming administration's promise to scrap the Iran nuclear deal. But today, he sits down at the International House at the University of Chicago to answer tough questions regarding his career in intelligence and the uncertainties inherent to our dynamic international society. Moderating today's discussion is Professor Robert Pate, founder of the Chicago Project on Security and Terrorism, a suicide attack database. Please help me welcome to the stage Professor Pate and Director Brennan.
You're in for a treat. I want to start with about a 20-minute conversation between myself and the director. Then we're going to open it up to questions, and they must be questions, short questions. Director Brennan, as director of the CIA, you worry more about threats to the United States than perhaps anyone else except the President of the United States. And there are tremendous questions about Russia. Tomorrow, you are slated to brief President-elect Trump. The country, the world, has been following this increasingly. Can you help us understand the Russian threat? Can you help us understand what motives Russia might have for manipulating an American election? Can you help us understand what would be the consequences of, given Russian manipulation, of reversing course and embracing Russia as an ally?
Well, Robert, thanks for starting off with such a softball there. And first of all, I just want to say it's an honor to be out here at University of Chicago, a university I probably couldn't have gotten into as a student. And I apologize for not being able to be here 4 or 6 weeks ago when I was scheduled to be. Yeah, there's a lot going on in the world, and obviously it's very topical right now in terms of what Russia did during our recent election. And as you pointed out, there's going to be a briefing for President-elect Trump in New York tomorrow that I will participate in, along with the Director of National Intelligence, Jim Clapper, Director of FBI, James Comey, and the Director of NSA, Mike Rogers. And President Obama had ordered up a comprehensive review of everything that we knew, everything that we know, and everything that we assess in terms of what Russia did during that period of time leading up to the election. How is it that we know it? What do we believe were and understand and assess their motivations to be and purpose? And we're going to be providing that briefing to President-elect Trump, as well as to members of Congress. There are briefings and hearings that are scheduled next week. Jim Clapper was up in front of the Armed Services Committee today in the Senate, addressed a number of these issues. And there will be a unclassified version, a report that will be coming out that will address those questions. I'm not going to get ahead of the publication of this, as well as the sequencing in terms of the briefings. I was at the White House today and talking to the President along with the others about this. Suffice to say that there's already been public acknowledgement by the President as well as by Director of National Intelligence and others that Russia did interfere in the recent presidential election. And we have a good understanding and appreciation of what it is that they did. As intelligence community professionals, it's our responsibility to make sure that we understand all the different types of threats to our national security that includes terrorism, proliferation, but also a threat to one of the foundational tenets of our democracy, which is a free and fair and open election. So this also speaks to the vulnerabilities that exist right now in terms of the digital domain, that there are so many things that can be done as a result of the tremendous explosion in technology. And we realize that we rely heavily on that technology on the internet to advance the human condition and to make all of our lives much more convenient. But at the same time, the more and more we are tethered to that environment, the more dependent we are on its security, on its reliability. And as we move to the Internet of Things, it's not just electoral processes that are subject to this type of exploitation. It's also our electric grids, our transportation systems, and others. So there are multiple dimensions to this. There is what Russia did, why it did it, and how we're going to address it. The Obama administration has already announced some of the measures that we have taken to let Russia and others know that this is unacceptable and it will be responded to. So there's the Russia relationship, there's the cyber challenge that we face, and then there's the great array of national security threats that we have to deal with on a daily basis.
So you have tremendous access, if not the most access, to information in our government. You see things from a vantage point that those of us on the outside really can't see. And you're also involved in debates with others that are able to see that information. And this is what we're engaged with right now, as far as I can tell. How do you see the strengths of that secret information at the moment? Do you see the problems in trying to communicate and persuade with secrecy, or is that really not one of the key obstacles to resolving this debate?
There is a tremendous amount of information that's available publicly, and policymakers and others will feed off of that information, and the intelligence community and others do as well. What we try to do is to make sure that we're able to gain insight into issues, developments, areas of the world that allow us to have a better understanding of some of the forces that are at play that are not available publicly. And there are various ways to gather that information. There is the clandestine collection, both human and technical. There is engagement with a lot of our partners overseas. So what we try to do is, again, taking into account the broad array of threats and challenges to U.S. national security. At CIA, we have responsibility to gain as much information, as much insight into these issues so that we can brief the President, members of Congress, and others about what the world stage has in terms of opportunities and challenges to U.S. national security interests. We want to make sure that we let people know what it is that we know, how we know it, our confidence level in it, what our intelligence gaps are, making sure they understand the distinction between what we have acquired in terms of intelligence, what we infer, what we judge and assess to be. CIA is in its 70th year. Throughout the course of those 70 years, there's been tremendous explosion in technology, so that we have tremendous ability to collect information, to store information, to pulse information and data against each other. There has been tremendous progress since 9/11 in terms of connecting the various elements of the intelligence community together so that CIA and FBI and Homeland Security and others are able to collaborate and cooperate and share information in an instantaneous fashion. So one of the challenges we have is that there's so much information out there, open source, clandestinely acquired, and it really runs the gamut from being factually correct, accurate, and true to bogus. And the challenge for CIA and for the rest of the intelligence community is to take into account all of that information, all those bits and pieces of data, and try to make sense of it. And what we're trying to do is to make sure that people understand that intelligence is not an end in itself. It is something that needs to empower others. Empower others to stop a terrorist attack, to stop a proliferator from acquiring certain materials or expertise, empower our policymakers to make sure that they understand the landscape so that they can identify the best policy option to pursue in order to advance U.S. national security interests. And so we recognize that we have a very solemn obligation at CIA to inform, to educate, to enlighten. And we don't have a problem with people who are going to disagree with us or to challenge us. We should be challenged with our assessments and our judgments and our findings. We have a statutory responsibility to make sure that we do what we can to keep this country safe and our fellow citizens safe. And we will continue to do it to the best of our ability.
So, sir, you started in the CIA in 1980, but started briefing presidents under President Clinton. So you've had a lot of experience with relationships with presidents. We now see in the last few months what appears on the outside to be a strange relationship between the president-elect and the intelligence community. Remarks from the president-elect which I think could be fairly described as disparaging. So I just wonder if you could address this a little bit also in context to help us understand, are we witnessing maybe a little more publicly skepticism that might have happened privately in the past? Is this sort of normal challenging or getting up to speed? How can you help us put it into context to understand what we're observing?
Well, the president obviously is the first customer for the intelligence community. I remember the first time I went into the Oval Office, it was in 1990 with President George Herbert Walker Bush, and I was going to talk to him about the implications of the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And I can remember going in there, I could literally hear my teeth chattering and my knees knocking, saying, what the hell is a kid from Jersey doing in the Oval Office representing CIA to the most powerful person in the world? And I have had the great privilege since then to have a lot of opportunities to engage with different presidents, all the presidents, and they all have different styles, different ways of absorbing information, different perspectives, different experiences in terms of international issues. So I've gone through, I think this will be my 6th presidential transition. And every president is going to be different than the last. And so President-elect Trump is going to be coming into office, being the first president, basically, who's never served in government before at any level, and I think is unfamiliar with the intelligence profession and intelligence capabilities. And as we know, President-elect Trump is somebody who communicates fairly regularly and in various ways. I have not had the opportunity to meet with President-elect Trump. I will do that, have that opportunity tomorrow. And one of the things that I really take great pride in at CIA is that it doesn't matter whether or not a president is Republican or Democrat, or whether they have good or bad feelings toward intelligence. We carry out these responsibilities. And so what I've told our workforce is, okay, maybe there is concern that an incoming president is going to be more skeptical about the worth of intelligence. This is the time for CIA officers really to strut their stuff, to be able to demonstrate just how good we are, how capable we are, the expertise we have, and what intelligence brings to the President of the United States. So look at it as an opportunity, somebody who is unschooled in what it is that we can do, and that we are part of the executive branch that the President will need to rely on. And I have seen, and just like with President Obama, when he came into office, he was a senator, and he had some exposure on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but there was a lot of the intelligence profession and capabilities that were very much unfamiliar to him. And I think maybe one of the reasons why I was invited to join the administration, because I could do some of the translation and interpretation about the intelligence vernacular, and making sure that he understood what the CIA does and what our capabilities are. And so I fully anticipate that the incoming administration will have a period of learning about what it is that the CIA does, what the intelligence community does. As I said, it doesn't bother me if someone's going to be skeptical and challenge our work and maybe disagree with our views. But I expect that the President of the United States will recognize that the CIA and intelligence community were established by statute for a very important reason. And it was in the aftermath of World War II, when we had the Pearl Harbors and other things, that we really need to have a world-class intelligence capability to keep this country safe. So, I am looking forward to interacting with President-elect Trump tomorrow. I am hoping that he is going to be respectful of the profession, respectful of the agency, as well as the rest of the intelligence community, and looking forward to a rather robust, if not sporty, discussion on this issue.
If only we could all be there. I'd like to talk about terrorism. So one of the things that you've spent years in is thinking about counterterrorism policy. As in the White House and now as director of the CIA, you've been closely involved with a number of our over-the-horizon air campaigns, sometimes called the drone campaigns, but it's not simply drones, realize, as counterterrorism efforts. Some of those appear quite successful, say Somalia, where there's a lot of contraction of the terrorist sanctuary. Iraq, tremendous contraction of the terrorist sanctuary. Some of those don't appear so successful, say the Afghan Taliban, gaining territory. Can you help us understand the varying degrees of success that we're observing and why? Why some are more successful than others?
Well, there are a number of phenomena that you point to there, which is the terrorist threat, instability, insurgencies, internal conflict, even civil wars. And you start off by talking about drones, predators. That is a tremendously capable and powerful instrument of war as well as of intelligence collection and surveillance that has been able to be used by great effect by the U.S. government. It's in the U.S. military's inventory to be able to take action when necessary to prevent terrorists from carrying out their deadly attacks. And I've had many conversations with President Obama about this, and sometimes you need to take life in order to protect lives. And the most solemn obligation of the President of the United States is to protect the lives of Americans. And if there is no other option to prevent such attacks other than taking that type of lethal action against a terrorist that is planning to carry out an attack, maybe against embassy facilities there, or to get on a plane with some type of IED that's going to bring it down, it's the path and the option of last resort that is used. So it's been used as a surgical weapon and a very successful one. But the ability to take terrorists off the battlefield is not a recipe for a solution to the challenges that an Afghanistan or a Yemen or Libya or Syria or Iraq face. There is pent-up frustration and political disenchantment and sectarian tensions and conflicts that are at play. That as we look back over the last several decades, a lot of the governments in these countries were authoritarian, did not take into account the diverse and varied interests of a diverse population, and ruled by the power of that authoritarian rule. And now there are challenges to that. So, for example, in Syria, it's a beautiful, beautiful country, a beautiful people that have been just decimated by this conflict that continues to go on because Bashar Assad has used these weapons against his own people when the Arab Spring was bubbling up inside of Syria. So it's not a question of just taking terrorists off the battlefield in Syria. It is how are you going to resolve some of those underlying factors and conditions that have allowed these safe havens to develop so that terrorists, whether it be an ISIL or a Jabhat al-Nusra, al-Qaeda, to take advantage of. So there is just a lot of issues right now in the Middle East, in South Asia. There is a lack of political processes and political reform. There is economic deprivation. There are these sectarian, ethnic, religious animosities. It's all coming to the fore. And that's why a lot of people think that the United States has abdicated its leadership role in a lot of these places. But I think we have to recognize that a lot of these trends and developments have their own engines. And the United States' ability to just say, okay, stop and cut it out is not there. So we exercise our power and our influence to the best we can, whether it be in Afghanistan, Iraq, or somewhere else. So again, the surgical capabilities of a drone is critically important, but it has to be a package of things that go from hard power to soft power, to military engagement, to political involvement, to influencing actors, both internal and external, in the areas.
So one of the tools that you're far more familiar with than again, just about anybody else is human, it's called HUMINT, or human intelligence. And one of the things that I see from the outside is that we appear to be much more able to collect or to have human intelligence on states than non-state actors. Is that true? Can you tell us about the role of human intelligence, our ability to penetrate the inner circles of Al-Qaeda? You know, so we not just had the story, but the movie about how it took years to find Osama bin Laden, and so it's not that human isn't playing a role, but it's just stunning to see the challenges and the difficulties of penetrating what's ultimately a relatively small group. But can you talk to us a little bit about the sort of tool here that a lot of us can't really get a grip on, this human intelligence side?
CIA is the functional manager and the lead organization for human intelligence, HUMINT. It's our responsibility to make sure that we're able to cultivate and develop relationships with individuals so that they can work with us and on behalf of U.S. government. We have been very successful over the years, and I'm not going to talk to you about how many sources and spies we have here or there. That's part of the business, is making sure that they're not exposed. But you're right, there are challenges, because trying to penetrate some of these terrorist organizations that practice tremendous operational security, and trying to make sure that you're able to, first of all, identify the individuals within this organization and in the positions of influence or leadership, and be able to gain access to them, either through individuals who may have an association with them or family members or whatever else. It's a painstaking, methodical effort that you need to really continue to invest in. And so whether or not we're talking about having individuals who are within governments, who are working on behalf of the United States and with CIA, or who are part of terrorist organizations, extremist groups, others, we constantly are looking at ways that we can, first of all, identify individuals that are of interest to us, gain access to them, be able to develop a relationship with them, and be able to convince them that this is really something that is very worthwhile for their interests, their family's interests, their country's interests. And also, there are a lot of individuals who come looking for us. Some of the most successful spy cases are individuals who are feeling that they are being maltreated in their countries, or that their countries have this authoritarian grip on their people. And they see the United States as being this beacon of democracy and freedom and liberty, and they put themselves at great risk and make great sacrifices because they believe in what the United States stands for. And so they at times come out and looking for CIA officers. And so we've been able to, again, take advantage of that. We do our utmost to protect them and their identities because their lives are on the line. And we take that obligation more seriously than anything else, which is to protect the identities and the well-being and the welfare of individuals who are operating around the world in various places and are giving us the insights, giving us the information that we cannot acquire in any other way. And that is something that the CIA does exceptionally well, better than any organization in the world, and we continue to do it.
So I'd like to ask a question about Iran, but also from your vantage point. So human intelligence often is about assessing the motives of actors, the motives of states. And so one of the things that, of course, you're involved with is assessing the motives of actors. And so we all know about the Iranian nuclear deal. We all know that it's, we don't know what the next president is going to do with that deal. However, can you help us understand the motives here to understand, was there a better deal available? And would an effort to try to get a better deal actually produce the outcome we want, given your assessment of motives?
You're absolutely right that there's a real distinction between capabilities and intentions. And we look at both of those very carefully, because as a country or a non-state actor's capabilities increase, we are very concerned about how those capabilities can be used against us. Whether we're talking about a Russia, China, or North Korea, or an ISIL or Al-Qaeda, whatever. That's why trying to understand what their intentions are and when they might plan to utilize those capabilities is critically important. And we need to be able to tell the president and others when we see the capabilities being married with an intention to carry out some type of action that is going to threaten U.S. national security. And that's where human intelligence can really give us some insights about what they're planning. Now, trying to get into Kim Jong-un's head in North Korea is really challenging, probably for him as well. And so when we see the trajectory of their ballistic missile nuclear program continuing to grow, at what point is he going to have the intention to use that capability? On the Iranian nuclear deal, I have said, is it a perfect deal? No. I mean, the perfect deal for the United States and for others would be for Iran to say, we're not going to do anything ever again, and we're going to give up everything. And that was unrealistic. So just like in any type of negotiation, what you try to do is to maximize what it is that you're going to get out of the negotiation. And I am surprised that the Iranians agreed to so much that is embedded in the JCPOA in terms of giving up the centrifuges, giving up the material that they had, and agreeing not to allow the nuclear program to go on, and also to allow the IAEA to have a very, very rigorous inspection regime. Early on, there was great skepticism that the Supreme Leader, even President Rouhani and others, would agree to such a deal. So when I look at what ultimately was agreed to, I think we got a lot more than we initially anticipated.
I see.
But in order to get that, we had to make sure that we then took the steps that were going to encourage the Iranians to sign on to that deal.
Wow.
And the Iranians, they have tremendous negotiating skills based in the bazaars and the Persian carpets, and so they're the best negotiators in the world. But I must tell you, the deal that was struck with the Iranians was better than a lot of people, including in the government, thought we'd get. And it was because the Iranians were determined to get themselves out of this downward economic spiral that sanctions were really the cause of. And so we recognized that there was a motivation on the part of the Iranians to strike a deal, and that's why we aimed high. And back and forth, we were able to get a lot that gave us assurance that over the next decade and more, that there's not going to be this march toward the development of a nuclear program and nuclear device. And so therefore, from an intelligence perspective, in terms of what the Iranians now are not able to do, to me, I think it was a very, very good deal.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to start to ask questions from the audience. Sir, you also have windows into the CIA that the rest of us don't. And can you help us? One of the big questions that's being debated now is the morale of the CIA. And it's already evident from how much you are bolstering that morale that you care quite a bit about it. But can you help us understand a little bit more context historically? Are we at a moment of vulnerability here with the morale of our intelligence community? Is it the case that a prolonged, beyond tomorrow, but a prolonged public disjuncture between the president and the intelligence community is going to have these consequences? Can you put it in a little more context here to help us understand just how vulnerable we are?
First of all, I think the morale of the CIA and the intelligence community is very high because we recognize the importance of the work that we do and the contributions we make to our national security. This period of time between Election Day and Inauguration Day is a rather special one because we're basically serving two administrations, the outgoing administration as well as the incoming administration. And the president-elect is getting the PDB, and yes, he's making comments about intelligence, but I would say let's see what happens post-Inauguration Day, when he is going to be the primary customer and he is going to have our national security in his hands. And I very much, as I said, hope that he is going to recognize the role and the importance and the criticality of what we do. And so our officers are primed and ready to do what it is that they have been trained to do. And so right now, I would say our morale is high. Yes, there is the speculation out there in the media and rumors about, you know, how the CIA or the intelligence community is going to be affected, but I'm telling them stay positive, stay optimistic, and it is now your responsibility to make sure that you're able to develop the relationship with the incoming administration that will then result in an appreciation and a recognition that the intelligence profession is critical to our national security.
Awesome, awesome. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Matt Enlow, and I'm a second-year student at the law school. This was in some ways discussed earlier tonight, but I'd like to ask about another angle. I know that you're meeting with him tomorrow, but this far it seems fair to say that the relationships between intelligence and Trump has been tumultuous at best. How will having, by all reports, a president uninterested in security briefings affect the mission of the intelligence community? Or, in other words, what aspect of the intelligence community's mission is most compromised by President-elect Trump's seeming distrust and disinterest?
Again, I'm going to give the president-elect the benefit of the doubt. As I said, I have not interacted personally with him, and I'm looking forward to the opportunity to talk to him tomorrow about what it is that the intelligence community knows and has assessed as far as Russia's involvement in the elections. And then over the remaining 15 days that I'm there, I'm going to make sure that CIA continues to provide the president-elect as well as members of his team the best intelligence that we can to prepare them for that day, as David was saying, that all of a sudden the new president takes over after he is administered the oath of office. So I would caution people to reserve judgment about what the future reality is going to be. And I have been in Washington for a number of years. I know that politics tend to swirl, and I know that there are things that are said and done on the campaign trail and in the political environment that once you leave that political environment and you leave the glaring spotlight of the public, then you really have to roll up your sleeves and say, okay, what are we going to do to keep this country safe? And I very much anticipate that the incoming administration and hopefully all the way up to the top, will take that obligation seriously and make sure they understand that this is a challenging world. There are a lot of threats out there that could really hurt this country's national security and our future.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Yang. So Trump's China bashing rhetoric often happens in his Twitter or his rally, but this doesn't make lots of Chinese worried. But one thing that makes Chinese worried is about Taiwan issue. So from the vantage point of CIA, is it possible that Trump would use Taiwan as a leverage to push China to deal with North Korea? So how risky is it?
One of the things I like about CIA is that we don't evaluate and assess what a president will do of the United States. Clearly, the Chinese are very concerned about Taiwan and the recent phone call that President-elect Trump had with the Taiwanese president. So they're watching that very carefully. Again, I anticipate that once the new administration comes in, they will make sure that they understand what the implications and consequences are of certain actions, as well as certain statements or things that people say. It's amazing the power of the word of the President of the United States. When the President of the United States says something, it can have ramifications, reverberations worldwide, on the political front, on the economic front, and the military front. And so I am anticipating that the next administration will understand just how important it is that when they take an action or make a statement, that they need to think through what the second and third order consequences are of it. That's what I think is one of the real attributes of President Obama, that he is somebody who looks at issues and then will immediately try to understand, okay, if I make this chess move, what does it mean as far as the second and third steps and moves that either the United States can make or what our adversaries or partners or allies will do?
So it's very risky.
Hi, Director Brennan. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Christina. I graduated from the college this past June. And I'd like to ask you how you feel about the irony that the CIA has a history in interfering in foreign elections, such as in Central and South America. And now it is the United States that has had foreign state interfere in our democratic process.
Yeah. Okay, next question. We have a 70-year history, and there are some things that are well known publicly, they've been written about and acknowledged, that took place in maybe the first half of the agency's history. And what people have to really understand is that the CIA is not a rogue organization that decides to muck around in foreign lands in terms of covert action. Every action that CIA takes needs to be authorized by a president, it needs to be deemed lawful by the Department of Justice, and it needs to have basically the consent and the support of the National Security Council principles. So they carry out those actions. So in the past, the agency was asked to do some things that by current standards, I think, are seen as beyond the pale and something we wouldn't do. And I can confidently say that when I look back over the last several decades, that since the Church and Pike Committee hearings and during that period of time, that the United States government and the CIA, as part of that government, recognized that there were some things that would be inappropriate for the United States to engage in. And I very much appreciate the fact that we have evolved. And I have said publicly that the types of things that Russia was involved in terms of interference in our election, this is something that we, the United States government, I believe, should not be involved in at all. The concept of free and fair elections should not just apply to the United States, it should apply to countries worldwide.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Khan. I'm a student from Istanbul, Turkey, and as you're well aware, we have suffered a lot of terrorist attacks recently and in this ongoing year. And basically, the role of the Turkish intelligence agency as a protector of Turkey has been very much challenged so far. So the question I have is that you know a lot about protecting a country, and why do you think that Turkey has been unable to prevent such attacks from happening in such frequency? And if you were to basically give me one kind of thing that you can say, what advice will you give to the Turkish intelligence agency director that they should change? Thank you.
Well, I have a very good and close relationship with Hakan Fidan, who is the head of Turkish National Intelligence Organization. And he has a very, very challenging job. Turkey, as you well know better than I do, sits at the crossroads between Asia and Europe, and between the areas of the Middle East that have been racked by political instability and where terrorists have rooted. Turkey is frequently used as that point to cross in order to move operatives or move material or other things. Turkey also has been racked by the PKK terrorism over the last several decades, but now also ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and others. And it's very, very tragic how many innocent Turkish citizens, as well as military and security officers, have fallen at the hands of terrorism. So it's not a question of the failures of Turkish intelligence. The challenges are tremendous. We here in the United States, I think, are very fortunate because of geographic location as well as resources and capabilities, that we don't have the same types of challenges that a country like Turkey or a country like Yemen or Libya or others face. And so unfortunately, terrorist groups, extremist groups, militant groups have used Turkey as a point to transit, as a point to burrow in, as a point to carry out attacks against the Turkish government. So it's not as though I believe that Turkey has done all it can do to prevent these terrorist attacks, because there are things that on the security front, in terms of information sharing and intelligence sharing, things have improved. I think we'd like them to improve even more. And also the government in Ankara has certain policies that they are continuing to try to modify and evolve so that they can address some of the concerns of the Kurdish minority inside of Turkey. So Turkey has many, many challenges, partly because of the neighborhood it's in, but also partly because of its history, as well as just the ability of these terrorist organizations to ply their trade inside of Turkey.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm also a student at the college, and I'm also from New Jersey.
Good. Whereabouts?
In Union County, Mountainside. It's a really small town.
Oh.
Yeah.
Mountainside is on Route 22. My parents live there.
Yeah, I live right off Route 22.
Yes. Okay. Good. Pardon us while we talk New Jersey.
That's great.
I was wondering how Russian interference in this election has differed from its interference in past elections.
Yeah, when you say past elections, you're not just talking here about the United States, you're talking about elections overseas. And we see that Russia's hand has been found in many different countries in terms of trying to take advantage of elections to support individual candidates, or to take advantage of corrupt officials who are willing to do things on behalf of Russia. Russia's active measures, covert influence as well as propaganda, is quite in evidence in many countries. What we see, and I think what you will be hearing in the coming days, is that it's the intensity, the scope, the scale of this is something that I think is different than what we saw in previous elections, certainly here in the United States. Part of it may be a factor of the continued opportunities that exist in the digital domain and increasing sophistication of capabilities that you can hide your hand, or try to hide your hand at least, in that digital environment. But I must say that the United States agencies have tremendous capabilities to uncover these types of activities. And I think one of the things that President Obama wants to do is not just to ring the bell about what Russian interference was in our recent election, but to have an ability to tell the world that this is something that you need to be watchful of and take steps to safeguard your institutions of governance so that it's not going to be subject to exploitation and manipulation by outside actors, whether it be Russia or others.
Could you extend that a little bit with upcoming elections in Europe, especially in Germany? Because there's quite a bit of concern that now Russia is kind of moving up in this, and Europe is next. Is Europe as vulnerable, more vulnerable? Can you just talk about your concerns about Europe?
Well, we do have concerns about Europe. We've seen that there have been activities on the part of Russia in previous elections in Europe. You point out the upcoming election in Germany this year. And we see that Germany is a critical ally of the United States and has been a stalwart in terms of maintaining sanctions on Russia. And Chancellor Merkel has been a tremendous partner and ally in this effort. And so might a President Putin try to use whatever types of opportunities that he'll take advantage of, whether it be cyber or other means, to try to shape the outcome of that election? I think that is a very serious concern. Again, that's one of the reasons why it was determined that it was very important for the United States to understand exactly what happened here so that we can not only safeguard our system, but we can also make sure that we inform others. And by exposing this publicly, may it make Mr. Putin more reluctant in the future to go down this path, because their activities are being uncovered and it's having a reputational hit on Moscow.
Thank you very much.
You mentioned that the president is the primary customer of the CIA. Federalist 64 on the treaty power says that whereas the president brings secrecy and dispatch, the Senate brings information and deliberate investigation. So I wonder what the role of the CIA should be, not only in relation to Congress, not only with respect to oversight, but actually to provide truth in a post-truth era, and especially where perhaps the president wants to dismantle alliances that had been assembled to check Russia, whereas the Senate might want to maintain those alliances. So I wonder whether we should see the CIA as having a role like the Federal Reserve, that the president should not be able to restructure it or dismiss the head of the CIA, and maybe also that the CIA could declassify information if it thinks proper.
There's a lot there.
Yeah.
The CIA is in the executive branch, and as I said, the president is the first customer. We provide support to policymakers across the executive branch, but I must tell you that I've spent a lot of time in the Congress briefing the congressional committees of jurisdiction, the Senate and the House Intelligence Committees, and I appear at hearings all the time. There are going to be hearings next week, and they serve a very important oversight role in making sure that the CIA is living up to its responsibilities and obligations, and we should be held to account for our activities. At the same time, I agree with, I think, what you're inferring here, which is that the Congress needs to make sure that they protect the role of the intelligence community and the role of the CIA, so that there would not be any type of arbitrary action on the part of the executive leader that would degrade or diminish the capabilities of the CIA and other intelligence agencies. Our authorities are rooted in statute. And so the president could not, by executive order, dismantle the CIA. They may not take full advantage of it, but the Congress not only should be an overseer of the agency, it should be a protector of that very, very valuable role that we play.
Good evening. As long as there's a strong demand in this country for cocaine, is there anything that the CIA can do to limit the harm that it does to the countries that it passes through in transit? For example, in Honduras, it seems like the military, the police, the political elite are corrupted from top to bottom, and the violence forces Central Americans to the border.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, and the impact of narcotics on our country continues to be profound in a very negative way. We at CIA, we work with a lot of our partners in Central and South America, as well as in Africa, to be able to uncover and to disrupt a lot of the narco trafficking routes. We have had great success in terms of providing intelligence support to a lot of those intelligence services in other countries. But you also made reference to the fact that corruption is endemic in a lot of these countries. And unfortunately, a lot of these narco traffickers and these drug dealers and the organizations that thrive on it have tremendous amounts of money. And they're able to get intelligence and security and police officials who make a modest income. And they are able to buy them, which really undermines the ability of these governments to arrest the continued growth and development of the narcotics and cocaine trade. This is something we have to continue to do. And so what we do at CIA is we work with what's called vetted units. These are individuals who are, in fact, not corrupted. They have to go through certain testing to include polygraphs and other things, so that we can have great confidence that when we give them intelligence about what a narco trader is doing, that they're not going to expose that to them. But this is a challenge, and that's why I think the United States government needs to invest more in the institutions of governance around the world. Because when we're talking about Africa or Central America, South America, there's still a lot of these systems or institutions and departments and agencies that are not able to carry out their responsibilities. And there are a lot of places where we can have police officers arrest individuals, but if there's not a judicial system that it's worth anything, they're just going to be arrested and then they'll be put back on the streets. So it has to be a sort of a full life cycle. be able to have intelligence, you be able to investigate, be able to arrest, be able to detain, be able to prosecute, be able to incarcerate, be able to rehabilitate. So it's not just the pointy end of the spear we have to be focusing on, we have to be looking at the system that stands behind the disruption efforts, whether we're talking about narco trafficking or terrorism as well.
Thank you.
I'm most worried about North Korea. I mean, nobody else is promising to bomb Seattle or LA on a regular basis. Do we have good intelligence on North Korea? And do you have any idea who could actually influence them? Whether it be some people talk about, China, and is China interested in that? And as the former speaker said, I mean, do you think we should use some levers against China to affect change there?
China has the most influence on North Korea of any state, bar none, because of the continued flow of trade back and forth. There are subventions that the Chinese give to the North Koreans. We are working with the Chinese, as we're working with the South Koreans, as well as Japanese and other partners and allies in the region, to have an agreed upon approach so that North Korea recognizes that its continued march toward this type of military capability is detrimental to its future. Unfortunately, you have individuals like Kim Jong-un and his father before him who continue to emphasize the growth of their military capabilities, believing that that's going to get them the international recognition that they need in order to be given the assistance that they want. So yes, China can turn the screws, so to speak, on North Korea, but I think China also is mindful that North Korea has a capability currently that they could exercise in terms of putting pressure on South Korea or embarking on a military adventure against South Korea. I think the Chinese personally can do more in order to put pressure on North Korea, but this is something that the next administration is going to have to pick up from the current administration, because again, the trajectory that North Korea is on is one that I don't think that we as Americans should allow to continue along that path.
So can I ask you also on this question to make an assessment for us about the future? So President-elect Trump has, at least during the campaign, talked about withdrawing some important support from our allies, South Korea, Japan, and actually said things to even encourage them to go their own way, maybe even to the point of nuclear weapons. What would those policies mean for North Korea?
Well, it would mean a lot. I think we have to be very mindful that our relationship and our partnership with South Korea and Japan is crucial. That if they feel as though they can no longer count on the United States in order to protect them from some type of North Korean military adventurism or attack, they're going to pursue their own course that may not be ones that we want them to go forward on. Last thing we need is for there to be a nuclear race in Northeast Asia. That's not going to be conducive to regional stability or global stability. And when we think about China, we have North Korean issue, we have cyber issues with China, we have South China Sea, we have trade issues, we have so many things. So the approach to China needs to take into account that it's multidimensional. But the North Korean dimension of it, I think, is one that is going to be critically important for us to be able to focus on. And Tokyo and Seoul and others are going to be watching the United States and Washington very carefully in the new administration to detect changes that would lead them to then adopt different policies or take their own actions. And this is what a President Trump and his national security team really need to have as full an appreciation of. Again, it's that multidimensional chessboard. You move that piece on one board, it really affects your positioning on another. So, and China is critically important in so many of these areas that I think this is what the next administration needs to recognize.
Yep.
Hello. So back in October, it was reported that many devices connected to the Internet of Things were used in a DDoS attack on the internet service company DIN. And I was wondering, you mentioned the Internet of Things as a potential target for hacking. So I was wondering if you had any suggestions to companies and policymakers to improve the security of these devices so they can't be used in attacks like this in the future.
Yeah, well, the DDoS attacks are something that take place on almost a regular basis. Several years ago, there were DDoS attacks that the Iranians were initiating against a lot of financial institutions in the United States. it was a wake-up call for a lot of banks because they're externally facing websites where you do your online banking really were not protected. They were not doing the type of security hygiene and regular patching that they need to do. So there are things that individual companies as well as individuals can do to make it more difficult for these hackers or these DDoSers to disable, disrupt your activities. That said, there is tremendous sophistication on the part of a number of adversaries. And it's not just nation states. It's a lot of companies or individuals, students, who have tremendous capability to cause problems. And what we have to do is to recognize that the more that we can work to safeguard networks and systems, the more difficult it's going to be for, not impossible, but the more we have to make it more difficult. The challenge for us in the future is recognizing that there is not a national consensus right now about what the role of government is in that digital domain. It is owned and operated 85% by the private sector. And so now we're having great debates about what the FBI should be doing in that digital domain. So the first complaint is, why isn't the government protecting us? Well, if you don't agree that the government has a role in that digital domain the way it has on the streets of Chicago or at our airports or at our seaports, we're not going to be able to protect that environment. And that's where I think the Congress really needs to come to terms with what are the statutory authorities they want to vest in intelligence and law enforcement agencies so that we can work with the private sector to safeguard that domain. And I think the ultimate, not solution, but the way ahead is to have an unprecedented partnership between government and private sector to try to safeguard as best we can that digital domain.
Okay.
Hi. So
Yeah,
during,
last one.
can you hear me?
Yep,
Yeah.
last
So
one.
during his term, President Nixon, he requested that the CIA give him intelligence that supported his policies overseas rather than intelligence that was inherently objective in nature. He saw the CIA as a tool that he could leverage to give himself more power and influence. Evidently, this caused his downfall because of how he used CIA in the Watergate scandal. So my question to you is, how is CIA going to react if President-elect Trump tries to use CIA in the same way as Nixon? If he wants CIA to give him not necessarily falsified, but intelligence that's not objective.
Yeah, no, good question, because any president could seek to use the intelligence community or CIA in order to advance and further a predisposition to do something. And it's one of the things that we train our officers in, especially our analysts, and we have a very rigorous analytic tradecraft training program. It's not enough to answer the question that is raised. It is important to make sure, because somebody could ask a very leading question, just like in court. You know, the defense attorney and the prosecutor will ask different questions because they want different answers to come forward. And we need to be mindful that a policymaker who is trying to circumvent the system could be asking a series of leading questions in order to only get the information or the answers that they want. We at CIA need to make sure that in addition to answering their questions, that we put it into context and making sure that the questioner is informed and enlightened about what the situation is or what the implications might be. And there was, you know, in the lead up to the Iraq War, concern within the intelligence community that some individuals in the last administration were looking for the intelligence that would justify moving against Saddam Hussein in Iraq. We learned a lot from that process. So there was the WMD Commission, and so now there is embedded ways that we can ensure that it's not going to be just intelligence that's going to support a single policy path on the minds of a policymaker, but we have an obligation to make sure that we push forward the full and comprehensive appreciation of what a situation involves. So I think we have to always be mindful that, and there may be some policymakers who, the best of intentions, believe it's critically important for national security to do X. We have to make sure that if they want to do X, they are first informed about what the implications are of X and what the maybe options are of Y and Z.
Before we go, sir, I'd like you to reflect in front of our audience here about that troubling issue I mentioned a few hours ago, and you did the 117. So for those of you who don't know, there are 117 stars in Langley that's beyond the seal. Those 117 stars represent the individuals who have died in the service of the CIA. You probably don't even know. And this is something that's one of the most difficult parts of a director's job. I believe 10 of those stars came under your watch. Could you please tell us about that? Could you please tell us about the real cost of collecting that information?
Yeah. It's very special, the CIA headquarters in Langley, Virginia, and hopefully you might have a chance to join us one day or to visit. And you walk into the lobby and you have that very famous CIA seal on the floor that is the scene for many movies. But then on the right-hand side of that lobby is the memorial wall that has those 117 stars, and those, each star represents a man or woman from the CIA who paid the ultimate sacrifice on behalf of this country. There are many of those stars that represent individuals of people that I knew personally and others that CIA knew personally. Every month I administer the oath of office to a new group of CIA officers in front of that memorial wall to underscore just how sacred the obligation is of all CIA officers to uphold the standards, the legacy, the tradition, the sacrifices of those officers. I have had the responsibility to welcome home the remains of CIA officers at Dover Air Force Base when cover considerations allowed me to go there. I've had the responsibility, the obligation, in many respects the honor and privilege to talk to their families. And I must say that their families are such a source of strength because, and I've had to do it recently, where they say that their loved ones died doing what they believed in so passionately, and they were supported by their families. One of my first bosses at CIA, Bob Ames, was killed in the bombing in Beirut in 1983, and he was just visiting Beirut when the embassy was devastated. And there are other individuals who I work with closely. It is something that we take seriously, just the way the Department of Defense and the Pentagon take seriously all of those brave men and women who have fallen in the line of duty for this country. The flag means something to us, and even though we cannot acknowledge who it was that fell, we carry that with us, and we always will. So I've had the tremendous honor and privilege to be a young 24-year-old joining the ranks of CIA for the first time in 1980, and now serving as director of CIA. And I know there's a lot of stories out there about what CIA does, but I can tell you with great confidence that if you knew what your fellow Americans were doing, who work in the CIA, or were doing for each and every one of you, you would be exceptionally proud of their sacrifices, their contributions, and what they believe in. And they don't do it for ticker tape parades. They don't do it so their names are plastered over the newspapers and the journals or on TV. They do it selflessly, they do it quietly, and they do it with tremendous capability, skill, and dedication to this country. That's why I have 15 days left at CIA. I can think of no higher honor in my public service than to be called the director of CIA. There's no other government job that would come anywhere close to this, because I have seen firsthand what CIA officers do around the clock, around the globe, and the toll it takes on them, and the sacrifices not just that they make, but their families make. It is something that truly is inspirational and invigorating. As I said before, we're not a perfect organization. We've made some mistakes. We've made some bad mistakes, but we have learned from them. But we are dedicated to making sure that the University of Chicago and other cities of this great country are going to be protected from those challenges, those threats that are out there, and they are real. And that's why I greatly appreciate the opportunity to talk to you today, because I couldn't be prouder to be up here and representing the men and women of CIA.
Well, and we are honored and privileged both for your service, your leadership, and also for coming today to share your experiences with us. Thank you, Director Brennan. That was fantastic. That was excellent.